So, what does this have to do with Buddhist temples? I know you're all asking this question. So, I've spent the last 5 years visiting all kinds of temples all over Thailand, okay? And doing measurements, taking photographs. So I'm going to talk about this. Okay. A lot of fun visiting these places, lots of tours, lots of discussions with monks, good perspective. So my thesis, okay, and this is the thing that I've been experimenting on, is that the design of temples, okay, you can say that the architect or the designer or the originator, whoever was the progenitor of temple design over many, many years, it was designed under 2 different spectra. One is daylight, broad spectrum, and then incandescent flame, which is also a broad spectrum. So my thesis is that the design, interior of temples is almost completely dependent upon the existence of these 2 spectra. That's why they're. And so if I then look at the color experience inside temples, okay, and you look at the kinds of colors and materials that get used inside temples, they align very closely with the spectrum that was used by the original designers. And so orange, reds, golds, okay? So if you're wearing gold or yellow and you have a flame is extremely rich in yellow and gold color. The gold dress looks very saturated, okay? And so this is kind of the experience that I've been looking at. So again, if I look at the color signatures of the original intent, if you look at the original intent behind Buddhist temples, it's a broad incandescent spectrum and a broad daylight spectrum. However, the spectrum that we use today inside temples are the lower ones. And what's different about the lower ones? One is that they're deficient or anemic, and they're not continuous. So my thesis is that there's a disconnect here, is that we have original design intent under incandescent and daylight, but we're lighting temples today is with discontinuous light sources that have what is called low R9, and I'm going to get into what that means. So we have natural light, we have LED, we have fluorescent, and we have incandescent. The middle 2 are discontinuous spectra. This is a color signature. This is an LED. These are LED light sources up here, these white light sources. And they have almost no red content in them. If you actually got out a meter and you measured these light sources, there's no red content inside it in comparison to daylight. Okay? It's also discontinuous in the green. It has very low green content. So if you have green or red, it's not going to look good. Okay? So the issues in today's design, if you walk into a Buddhist temple or many Buddhist temples, is that there's issues with naturalness, discrimination, and fidelity. These terms you're going to be using in your career. If you go out and become architects and you're dealing with interiors, you're going to be using this. So I want you to understand. Fidelity. Fidelity is like truth, okay? Is that when I look at this tomato on the right, the tomato looks like a tomato should look. It looks like that's good. But if I take the same tomato and I put it underneath 70 CRI light source, like this one here, it's going to look not great. So it's not true to nature. Okay? So naturalness is a very similar concept. And again, this is the professor here. Professor on the left, hand looks reasonably natural. This is what I should look like. Okay? However, on the right side, it's yellow and anemic. Looks very, very unnatural. Again, what does this have to do with Buddhist temples? The next concept is discrimination. So if I have a whole series of materials that we would say green, but I want a very specific green, okay? It's going to be very easily rendered under a broad spectrum. But if I use a spectrum like I'm showing at the top there that has very little green, I'm not going to be able to recognize small differences. Yeah. You go into an interior like this that has very complex and subtle color experiences. There's many different shades and tints of gold, amber, and woods inside these. Okay? The light source in there has almost no red content in it, no red spectrum. Okay. So I've gone out to many temples. Okay. All of these temples were designed with daylight and incandescent, but now they're lit with very anemic light sources. And you can see the fluorescent light source on the column there, right here. This light source has almost no red content spectrum in it. Okay. But if you look at the very subtle uses of red and amber in here, the color in here is going to appear very unsaturated. The original designer intent on this was not this. It's a very unsaturated experience. And so I have hundreds of these studies. Again, very complex use of color and blending, mostly in the reds and amber region. And the light sources that are being used here, if you look closely, these are compact fluorescent. They have almost zero red content inside it. Okay? So how do you expect to render these kinds of materials that are mostly red? So I have a whole listing of color, but there's lots of reds, golds, and ambers that get used inside the design of Buddhist temples. The light sources here almost completely deficient in that spectrum. Okay. And so when you go into these environments, they appear very muted, okay, or very flat. Okay. So if you want a very intense, I don't want what you would call it, but very intense religious experience, but you're being deprived completely of saturated color, which is very different from what the original intent from the designer, you're going to be left not having the kind of quality architectural experience. This is a very expensive piece of architecture. Okay? Somebody spent a lot of time doing this, enormous amount of time. This is a $10 light bulb that has no red in it. So you can imagine how poor this looks underneath this light source. Okay? It's a little hard to see in this picture, but this is a fairly complex visual scene. They put together a lot of different materials that are very saturated. They have a compact fluorescent in a small reflector lamp illuminating this. So it's absolutely the cheapest light source you could possibly use inside that interior, and it completely renders this in a very flat, unsaturated kind of experience. The people or person that designed this did this under candle, incandescent, daylight. Very broad, rich light sources. This light source here, okay, with the daylight coming in and the flame light renders this perfectly. Okay? It's a very broad spectrum. It's very rich in the red. So you're getting the daylight across this, and you're also getting the light from the flame. This is the original intent of the designer. Okay. Same kind of design, but here they have fluorescent light sources here, compact fluorescent light sources here. This is extremely flat, okay, completely separate from what the designer intended. This one kind of summarizes a lot of my thesis. Is very rich red carpeting material, lots of golds, lots of wood. Okay. So during the daytime, this is a very rich, broad spectrum. This is very, very well rendered. So this is actually very well intended. But in the evening, fluorescent light source is lighting this. Very inexpensive, and it leaves it very flat. I found this one very, very interesting. I mean, there's a lot happening here. Okay, this is someone who spent a lot of time on this. These are compact fluorescent light sources that have no red in them, very, very low red. And this is pretty much across the board of all the temples I've toured all over Thailand. So the issues here are, again, naturalness, discrimination, and fidelity. And these are all things that are very important to the architectural community. When you're doing an interior, you want this. And I go back to this slide here. If you're using a very complex series of colors, and this is a little bit different than this, and this is a little bit different than this, but you want this, it's very difficult to make that decision underneath this light source. If you want somebody to have this experience with green, very difficult to do that with this. Okay? I've dug into this with materials that get used in temples, and this is different silks that get used inside temple design. This is a very subtle, complex color. It's dichroic. It has different greens in the same material. Okay. So let's use something that is, if I look at sort of big changes or small changes in tint or chroma, and chroma is very common in our industry, in the design industry, we would call this red. Okay? But there's all kinds of different values, brightnesses, and different chroma or saturation. And these are all terms that you folks should know. But we call this red. Okay? But there's all kinds of different reds. So if I'm lighting a Buddhist temple with red, with fluorescent, this is the only amount of red that I've got inside that Buddhist temple. You're not going to be able to tell the differences between these subtle colors. Now with daylight or incandescent, it's very rich in red. There's a lot of red material there to be reflected. So now I can make subtle differentiation between this. Okay? So one is, what does the designer want? If I want this, I need to have this. But if I have this, you're not going to see this. Okay? So it works both ways. So the desaturated color experience leaves people at a subconscious level very dissatisfied with a temple experience. So I dug into this more. Okay? The issue with R9, because these light sources are very deficient in spectra, is that you end up with unsaturated colors. The materials that are used are golds, reds, wood, and skin tones. Skin tones, okay? So I dug into this more. Gold, okay? Gold gets used a lot in temples, okay? Gold. If I look at the spectral signature of gold, I take a piece of gold and I measure how does it respond to light, okay? It reflects a lot of light in this region here, between 600 nanometers and 1,000 nanometers, okay? And not so much in this, okay? That's why it appears gold. And this is basically, if somebody said, please, draw me what the spectral signature of gold is. That's what it is. Okay? Now, if your light source is this, you can see there's almost no radiation in that wavelength, in this light source. So golds are going to appear very flat. You have to have gold color in order to be reflected into your eye. Okay? Materials and fabrics. Okay? So this is red, orange, yellow, and cadmium yellow light. So all the different kinds of fabrics that get used inside this also have spectral signatures that are very biased towards the yellow-red end of the spectrum. Okay? So if I look at these fabrics, so these are the color signatures for fabric. When you buy a piece of fabric, when you're an architect, you can buy a piece, specify a fabric. You can say, what is the signature? And they'll send you this. Okay? But if I'm trying to light these with this light source, it's not going to work. I looked at wood. Woods get used a lot in Buddhist temples. Okay? Okay. Lots of wood. And wood, this material here on the tables, if you measure the spectral signature, it looks like this. And it's predominantly reflective in the red end of the spectrum. Okay? And with fluorescent light sources, you're not going to do that. And I've looked at all kinds of different woods. People appearance inside temples, also very important. Okay? And so if you have low R9, okay, low red content, people are going to look very pale. If you look at the spectral signature of blood, it's mostly reflective in the red. So if you don't have red, people are going to look like ghosts. Not a good thing for Buddhist temples. Okay? And I've got all kinds of measurements on skin, and it's basically very reflective in the red end of the spectrum. We need to have red. That's why we look really good outside, or under flame, or in the fireplace. And again, it's this phenomena here, is that these are all the different chroma for skin. Okay? And you need to have a very rich spectrum in order to see that, not this one. Okay. And this has to do with this kind of thing. You can look like a ghost, okay, or you can look very rich and saturated. You need to have that kind of color. And my thesis is, when you light under the first two spectra, you're going to look good. But when you light with the other ones, you're going to look very pale and anemic. So it's very important to have a high R9. So the issue is, can you do it? Okay. So today's technology, the LEDs that we have in the ceiling here are this red line here. And it means that it's very deficient in the red. Modern LEDs, the ones that are just coming into the marketplace, can have a very rich red experience. And so if I test the individual colors on this, these are all color samples. And this is the way the color industry samples light sources, is they measure what's called R1 through R15, is that it needs to render color. This is like 98% as good as daylight, 95% as good as daylight. The commercial light sources, like we have in here, have almost no red in them. Okay? So it's the absence of red. So looking at this a little bit more simply, this is daylight, and this is LED, and this is with a high quality LED that's almost like sunlight. Okay? Almost like sunlight. So in sort of our evolution, is we're moving from incandescent, fluorescent to LED inside our spaces. Okay? When the temples were done, it was either incandescent or flame. Okay? We then moved to this. Temples don't look good. We're moving to this, but we're not using the right types. Okay? So what does this mean to buildings that we commonly work with? And so in California, I'm very involved with developing design standards for architects. And the materials in the home, very similar, lots of wood, okay? So you need to have high R9. So when a person goes to a store to buy lamps for the home, what kinds of lamps get used in these kinds of environments? Unfortunately, the lamps that we've had experiences with, fluorescent, are, as you know, very deficient in the red end of the spectrum. So there was a lot of pushback on this because we were having this in the home. People were looking pale. Okay. So we developed in California a standard for lamps where we would move from this to this in order to be close to what this is. So now when you buy a lamp in California, it looks like this. Okay. So it's possible today to use high color rendering light sources. So my work, I'm doing a lot of study on how do these things look, what's their relative appearance, and I wrote a specification that calls for high R9 and a high color rendering index for all commercial lamps. And this is now state law in California that you must have broad spectrum lamps. So the question I get asked is does this mean anything outside of just appearance? Okay. So I'm doing studies looking at human performance with color. And so we have a lab, and this is a study that I've been working on for a number of years, where I take students and I put different lights and I measure how well can they sort color under different spectra. Okay. And what we found was people can do better, can sort colors more efficiently and more effectively under high color rendering lamps. And again, it has to do with this, is that if you give people this, they can't tell the difference. Okay. So now I'm applying this to hospital design. And so in hospitals, we're very concerned about color, particularly how do people look. Okay. So the new hospitals now, we're very interested in how do people look medically. And so doctors do diagnosis here based on how red or how unred do they look relative to health. And so it's the same thing that we're seeing inside Buddhist temples, and people look very pale. And so being able to do discrimination, you want to be able to see different colors. Okay. So I've been working with medical professionals on this, and we've been experimenting in doctors' offices with high color rendering lamps. And we did a big study on this in dermatology, and now the standard for hospitals in California is high color rendering lamps. And this is basically looking at different skin tones and how does the light source work relative to skin. And it's all based on these kinds of studies. So I'm running out of time here. So what I was going to do was close on this one and open this up for questions. Okay? I know it's a lot of material at once, but color is going to be a big part of your future. If you stay in design and architecture, color and color environments are going to be very important. I'm continuing with the Buddhist temple research. And my objective on that is to develop standards, design standards for Buddhist temples. And we're getting some traction, we're getting some interest moving forward with the idea that your tourist agencies are very interested on preserving historic buildings. So we're going to try to apply this color standard in that area.